Israel, a land of great antiquity, where the streets practically ooze humus and the sun-kissed hills echo the wise teachings of prophets. But wait, there is something else bubbling up amid the falafel stands and ancient ruins. Something sinister, perhaps? Yes, my friends. I am referring to none other than the infamous white colonialist Israelis. You have heard of them, right? They have been all over the news, monopolizing the land, exploiting resources, and generally ruining the Middle East with their obsessive desire to exist. Allow me to introduce you to a few of these dastardly characters. Number 1. Ethiopian Jews. Ethiopian Jews trace their origins to ancient Israel, with a tradition that links them to the biblical tribe of Dan or to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. They developed a unique form of Judaism, shaped by a combination of the Torah and their isolated environment. Over the centuries, they lived mainly in northern Ethiopia, often facing discrimination and isolation from their Christian and Muslim neighbors, as well as doubts from other Jewish communities about their Jewishness due to their distinctive religious practices and absence from mainstream Jewish history. In the early 20th century, as Zionism began to gain momentum in Europe and the Middle East, Ethiopian Jews also looked toward Israel as their ancestral homeland, referring to it as Jerusalem. However, because of their geographical isolation and the skepticism of Jewish authorities regarding their Jewish status, efforts to immigrate to Israel were limited. It was not until the mid-20th century that a more concerted effort to connect with Ethiopian Jewry began. In 1973, Israel's chief Sephardic rabbi, Ovadia Yosef, declared that the Beta Israel community was indeed Jewish under Jewish law. This decision laid the groundwork for their formal immigration to Israel. By the early 1980s, conditions for Ethiopian Jews had deteriorated due to famine and political instability in Ethiopia, particularly under the rule of the Derg regime. In response, Israel launched Operation Moses, a secret airlift that brought around 8,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel from refugee camps in Sudan. However, the operation was cut short when its existence was leaked to the international media, leaving many Ethiopian Jews stranded. A few years later, in 1991, the situation for Ethiopian Jews worsened as Ethiopia descended into civil war. In a dramatic 36-hour airlift known as Operation Solomon, Israel flew more than 14,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel in a single weekend. This operation was a major achievement, highlighting the complex and perilous journey that many Ethiopian Jews undertook to reach Israel. Nowadays, there are approximately 170,000 people of Ethiopian descent living in Israel. Additionally, there are hundreds of thousands of North African Jews, descendants of Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, and Algeria. Number 2, Yemenite Jews. The history of Yemenite Jews is a rich and complex tale of survival, resilience, and religious devotion over many centuries, marked by their eventual migration to Israel. The Yemenite Jewish community has a long-standing connection to Jewish life in the Middle East, maintaining traditions that predate many other Jewish communities. The Jewish presence in Yemen dates back more than 2,000 years. According to tradition, the first Jews arrived in Yemen either during the time of King Solomon or following the destruction of the First Temple in 586 BCE. Historical evidence suggests that by the early centuries of the Common Era, Jewish communities were well established in the region, maintaining trade connections with the broader Middle East and practicing a unique form of Judaism influenced by the local environment. Yemenite Jews maintained strong connections to the written Torah, developing a distinctive system of pronunciation and liturgical practices. Despite their isolation from other Jewish communities, Yemenite Jews preserved a religious tradition that many scholars consider closer to biblical Hebrew than those of other diaspora groups. For centuries, Jews in Yemen lived in relative isolation, separated from the broader Jewish world. Their legal status as dhimmis, protected but second-class citizens under Islamic law, meaning they had certain rights, but also faced various restrictions. Throughout history, Yemenite Jews experienced periods of tolerance punctuated by persecution, especially under some more fanatical rulers. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw the beginnings of Yemenite Jewish migration to Ottoman-controlled Palestine. Inspired by religious fervor and a longing to return to the land of Israel, small groups of Yemenite Jews began to make the difficult journey to the region, which they referred to in Hebrew as Eretz Yisrael. During the first major Jewish immigration period between 1881 and 1903, Yemenite Jews began settling in Jerusalem and agricultural settlements throughout the land. But the most dramatic moment in the modern history of Yemenite Jews came shortly after the establishment of the State of Israel. As the political situation in Yemen deteriorated and anti-Jewish violence intensified, the Israeli government, in collaboration with American Jewish organizations, launched a secret operation to bring Yemenite Jews to Israel. Operation Magic Carpet airlifted more than 49,000 Yemenite Jews from Yemen to Israel between June 1949 and September 1950. The operation was shrouded in secrecy, and many Yemenite Jews were brought to Aden by foot under perilous conditions before being flown to Israel. This mass immigration to Israel marked the near-total removal of the Jewish community from Yemen. Number 3. Iraqi Jews. The history of Iraqi Jews is a story of one of the oldest and most distinguished Jewish communities in the world, stretching back more than 2,500 years. The Jewish community in Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia, dates back to the Babylonian captivity, beginning in 586 BCE, when Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II conquered the kingdom of Judah and exiled a large number of Jews to Babylon. This exile marked the start of a Jewish presence in what is now Iraq, one of the oldest continuous Jewish communities outside the land of Israel. Jewish life flourished in Babylon, becoming a center of Jewish scholarship and religious development. Many Jews remained in Babylon even after the Persian king Cyrus the Great allowed them to return to Jerusalem in 538 BCE. Over the centuries, Babylonian Jews developed the Babylonian Talmud, one of the most important works of Jewish law and theology, solidifying the region's place as a key center of Jewish thought. From the 6th to 11th centuries, Babylon, modern Iraq, was the intellectual heart of the Jewish world. During this period, the heads of the leading academies, known as the Geonim, Hebrew for geniuses, guided the interpretation of Jewish law and responded to inquiries from Jewish communities across the diaspora. The cities of Sura and Pumbedita became famous for their academies, where much of the Babylonian Talmud was codified. Under Muslim rule, the Jews of Babylon initially enjoyed periods of prosperity and relative autonomy, contributing to trade, science, and scholarship. However, their status as dhimmis, protected but second-class citizens under Islamic law, meaning they were also subject to restrictions and occasional persecution. By the 16th century, Iraq was part of the Ottoman Empire. The Jewish community in Baghdad and other cities continued to be an important part of the regional economy, engaging in trade and finance. Jews were integrated into Baghdad's elite merchant class, and by the 19th century, Iraqi Jews were a significant portion of Baghdad's population, where they lived relatively peacefully, though subject to periodic discrimination. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Jewish community in Baghdad experienced a cultural renaissance. Jewish schools were established, and newspapers were printed in Hebrew, Judeo-Arabic, and later Arabic. Jews were prominent in trade and finance, especially as the Ottoman Empire modernized its economy. After World War I, Iraq came under British control, and a monarchy was established in 1921. Initially, Iraqi Jews thrived under British rule. Many Jews took up prominent roles in the government, trade, and banking sectors. However, as Arab nationalism grew, anti-Jewish sentiment increased. During the 1930s, anti-Jewish policies became more pronounced, fueled by rising Arab nationalism and the spread of Nazi ideology in the Middle East. This shift began to erode the position of Jews in Iraqi society. One of the most traumatic events for Iraqi Jews was the Farhud, a violent pogrom in Baghdad that occurred in 1941 during the Jewish holiday of Shavuot. The Farhud resulted in the deaths of between 180 and 600 Jews, with hundreds more injured, and Jewish homes and businesses were looted and destroyed. After the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, the situation for Jews in Iraq deteriorated rapidly. Iraqi Jews were increasingly targeted by the government and nationalist groups, facing persecution, discrimination, and accusations of Zionist sympathies. Between 1950 and 1951, the Iraqi government allowed Jews to leave the country under the condition that they renounce their citizenship and forfeit their property. More than 120,000 Iraqi Jews, around 90% of the Jewish population, were airlifted to Israel in a mass migration operation known as Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. This operation, named after the biblical figures who led the return of Jews to Jerusalem from Babylonian exile, marked the end of millennia of Jewish presence in Iraq. Most of the Jews left behind all their possessions, and their property was confiscated by the Iraqi government. Today, there are somewhere between 450,000 and 600,000 Iraqi Jews in Israel. Four, Persian Jews. The history of Persian Jews is one of the oldest and most enduring in the Jewish world, with a presence that dates back more than 2,700 years. The Jewish community in Persia, modern Iran, can trace its origins to the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE. When the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Persian king Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE, he issued the famous Cyrus Cylinder, allowing the Jews exiled in Babylon to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. This event is recorded in the Bible, making Cyrus a key figure in Jewish history. Many Jews chose to remain in Persia even after the decree of return, forming a significant community. Under Persian rule, Jews enjoyed religious autonomy and generally favorable conditions. This era is notable for the story of Purim, which is set in the Persian capital of Shushan, modern-day Susa, and tells of Queen Esther, who saved the Jews from extermination under King Ahasuerus, Xerxes I. In the 7th century, Persia was conquered by the Arab Muslim armies, leading to the establishment of Islamic rule. Jews, along with Christians and Zoroastrians, became dhimmis, protected but second-class citizens under Islamic law. Over the centuries, the status of Persian Jews under Muslim rule fluctuated. There were long periods of relative peace and prosperity, especially under the Safavid and Qajar dynasties. However, there were also times of persecution, forced conversions, and pogroms, particularly during periods of political instability or religious extremism. At times, the Jewish community faced heavy taxation and had to live in segregated quarters. In some periods, Jews were forbidden from riding horses or from leaving their homes during certain Islamic holidays, and they were often subject to social discrimination. Reza Shah Pahlavi's secular reforms in the early 20th century aimed to modernize Iran, and under his rule, Jews gained greater rights and freedoms. Many Persian Jews moved to urban centers like Tehran, where they began to thrive economically, engaging in trade, commerce, and other professional activities. During World War II, Iran was occupied by British and Soviet forces, and the Jewish community remained largely unaffected by the horrors of the Holocaust in Europe. After the war, the Jewish population in Iran continued to grow in number and influence. By the 1940s, Iranian Jews played a prominent role in the economy, and Jewish schools and organizations flourished. With the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, many Persian Jews began to consider immigration to Israel. However, the political climate in Iran remained relatively stable for Jews under the Pahlavi monarchy, and immigration to Israel remained limited in the early years. Under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, Iran's Jewish community experienced relative prosperity. The Shah promoted secularization and westernization, and many Jews enjoyed freedoms not available in other Middle Eastern countries. During this period, some Persian Jews moved to Israel, but most remained in Iran, where they were integrated into the upper echelons of society. The 1979 Islamic Revolution, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, marked a turning point for Iranian Jews. The revolution replaced the secular monarchy with an Islamic theocracy, leading to fears of religious persecution. Although Khomeini declared that Jews were a protected minority, the revolution's anti-Israel and anti-Zionist rhetoric caused great unease within the Jewish community. In the aftermath of the revolution, around 80,000 Jews lived in Iran, but the rise of the Islamic Republic led to mass emigration. Tens of thousands of Jews left for Israel, the United States, particularly Los Angeles, and Europe. Jews who left Iran often had to leave behind their wealth and property. The new Islamic regime imposed severe restrictions on Jewish life, particularly regarding Jewish institutions and ties to Israel, which was viewed as an enemy state. Many Jews faced suspicion of espionage, and some were arrested or executed. Today, there are somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 Persian Jews in Israel. So there you have it, folks. My white colonialist Israeli friends. They are everywhere, from the beaches of Eilat to the mountains of the Galilee, colonizing with every hummus they dip their pita into. Their ultimate goal? Well, that is simple. They, along with Indian Jews, Mexican Jews, Russian Jews, Afghani Jews, Lebanese Jews, Turkish Jews, and even Asian Jews, just want to live. But living in the Middle East as a Jew? Come on. We all know that is just a front for a centuries-old white colonialist plot. It is almost as if they have some kind of crazy belief that they have the right to exist in the Jews' ancestral homeland. What an utterly ridiculous concept.